Hey, good morning, bro. It's Friday, August 3rd, 2018, and me and you need to have a conversation, dog. We need to talk about who is Coda Bang, what is a ghetto scholar, and why the hell did I start a podcast, man? And unlike most of life's questions, the ones I just asked are very easy to answer, baby. I'm Coda Bang. I be reading books and shit, and I want to smoke a joint and talk to you about them, man. I figured the best way for me to do that was to start a podcast, because, well, my friends won't shut the fuck up long enough for real life for me to actually get a word in, so here you go. Now, I want to do this because I used to have a YouTube channel with my guy, John Martin, and the goal for this podcast is the same as it was for the YouTube channel, and that's to talk to niggas about shit that you might not know, whether that's history, politics, economics, whatever. The point is, if you skip school, don't like to read, don't know what to read, then, talk to your boy, and hopefully we can work something out. Maybe you learn something, and maybe I learn something by the end of this. Now, the way this is gonna work is around the first of every month, and I say around the first of each month because it took me like 3 days to figure out how to get this podcast recorded and uploaded right. But around the first of each month, I'm going to upload a long form podcast, maybe a couple hours long, and in the weeks kind of in between episodes, I'm going to do a little check-in, see how everybody's doing, answer any questions you might have about the episode, and maybe do a quick little review. But with that being said, I want to get into our first subject, the autobiography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now, the impression I had about King after reading this book was crazy, man. He was more militant, he was deeper, and he was more incredible than I ever gave him credit for. I mean, I knew he was a preacher from down south somewhere. They made a movie about him. He gave some good speeches. I have a dream and all of that. But I was born 20-some odd years after King was assassinated, so they only talked about him on his birthday in January and maybe a little bit during Black History Month. And, I know what you're thinking. And, yeah, I did go to terrible schools, and that wasn't a complete accident, But King, from my estimate, went from these little skirmishes with authorities in Alabama to being involved in large-scale international politics. And from where I'm sitting, that's like being a local SoundCloud rapper and going on to sell 20 million records or something, man. It's a great rise to prominence and influence for a brother back in the 50s and 60s. So this book was published in 1998, and it was put together by a guy named Claiborne Carson. And Claiborne Carson is the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford in California. And he collected the writings of Martin Luther King and organized them into this book, because I don't think King was really necessarily intending to put out a biography or write his life story at the time. I mean, because his life ended so abruptly. But all of his journalings, all of his sermons, every speech that he wrote, and this guy, Mr. Carson, was able to get these documents and put everything together with the help of some graduate students at Stanford. So starting out early on in the first few chapters, man, King talks about where he was born and how he grew up. And King was born during, right at the beginning of the Great Depression in Atlanta. And he says that seeing that much poverty, the bread lines, and people, wanting for so much, had a profound effect on his, quote, anti-capitalist feelings, end quote. And the Great Depression was much worse than the most recent recession we just went through. I mean, during the recession, some people lost their houses. You might have to move back in with your mom and dad. But during the Great Depression, people were actually dying of starvation. There were large bread lines where the government had to give people food, man, because the economy was just so bad. But during this time of extreme poverty and neediness in the country, his mother was telling him, you're just as good as anyone. And we take for granted how hostile the environment was during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And from 1882 to 1968, there were about 4,700 something lynchings in the United States. And of those 4,700 lynchings, about 3,446 of those were black folks. So over almost a 90-year period, you got damn near 40 black people a year getting lynched. So black folks all throughout the South had to live with the fact that they could get ripped from their homes, they can get beaten, they could get lynched with no protection or recourse from the police or from the judicial system. King was also very proud of his father, and he wrote about him fondly in the first few chapters of this book. And MLK Sr. was a sharecropper son. And sharecropping, for all my niggas that skip class, is where black folks basically went from being slaves on somebody's land to renting that land on these people's property on his former slave master's property and giving that person a share of their crop at the end of the year. And MLK Sr. Had an incident where he had to confront the landowner of the sharecropping operation because he tried to short his father. He tried to get over on his father, and his father, being, an old school Negro from back in them times, told him, be quiet, shut up, man. And that was the attitude of that generation back in that time. And MLK Sr. couldn't take that. He wasn't going to take that. So at 18, he left the farm and moved to Atlanta with no education whatsoever. He enrolled himself in high school and didn't stop until he actually graduated from Morehouse College. And his father was a real principled man, and we can see where some of these ideas and some of these values started to rise up in King. He said his father refused to ride the bus after he witnessed a black man being attacked by a white bus driver. And he talks about, having a relatively comfortable life, despite segregation in the area where they came up when he was growing up. So he knew that he can call on his dad, this large, intimidating black man, if things got rough. He said, if things got rough, I would call my father and, quote, things were solved, end quote. And that's kind of gangster when, the way that he put it, like, yeah, if I had a problem, things just got solved, man. I don't know how he did it, but he worked it out, King also experienced a lot of hatred for white people at a young age, which is interesting compared to the image that represented a King now, because we just receive him as a saint, or they promote him as a saint, and he was a great guy, but we never see that aspect of his character from when he was a young man. At 14, he competed in an oratorical competition in Dublin, Georgia. And the subject of this competition was the Negro and the Constitution. And at 14, here's what King had to say. Quote, "We cannot have an enlightened democracy with one group living in ignorance. We cannot have a healthy nation with 1/10 of the people ill-nourished, sick, harboring germs of disease which recognize no color lines, obey no Jim Crow laws. We cannot have a nation orderly and sound with one group so ground down and thwarted that it is almost forced into unsocial attitudes and crime. We cannot be truly Christian people so long as we flout the central teachings of Jesus, brotherly love and the golden rule. We cannot come to full prosperity with one great group so ill delayed that it cannot buy goods. So as we gird ourselves to defend democracy from foreign attack, let us see to it that increasingly at home we give fair play and free opportunity for all people. Today, 13 million black sons and daughters of our forefathers continue to fight for the translation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments from writing on the printed page to an actuality. We believe with them that if freedom is good for any, it is good for all, that we may conquer Southern armies by the sword, but it is another thing to conquer Southern hate. That if the franchise is given to the Negroes, they will be vigilant and defend, even with their arms, the ark of federal liberty from treason and destruction by her enemies." End quote. Bars. I was saying a lot for a 14-year-old in 1940 in Jim Crow, Georgia. He put those thoughts together that succinctly, that precisely at 14 years old. And he won a competition with that speech. And then he had to ride the bus for an hour and a half in the heat back to Atlanta, and he had to stand because a white person needed a seat. Yeah, I'd be a little mad at white folks at that point too. But that's what makes Martin Luther King Jr. so dope. He had been sort of bred for this. He comes from a rebellious stock, for one, because of his father. And then he was deeply sensitive to injustice and ridiculously smart in terms of philosophy, theology, morality, religion, and all those things. King's so smart, he starts Morehouse College at 15 years old. Where's that went? Like, what was you doing at 15, my guy? What was you in? 10th grade? 11th grade? Like, that's a high caliber intelligence. I don't think a slouch, a lazy person, a stupid person gets into college at 15. So we see this thing of morality start to emerge in King's writing and his thought process as well after he gets into Morehouse. We often associate King with words like justice, peace, civil rights, but he wrote specifically about morality a lot at the start of this book. And at Morehouse, King got into, Henry David Thoreau, who was an abolitionist, anti-slavery protester, philosopher, poet, writer. I can't say he was really anti-slavery protester because he wasn't really protesting right there, but he was definitely an anti-slavery proponent. So Henry David Thoreau wrote this essay on nonviolent resistance, and it seems to be like a seed that was planted there because King starts to get this idea of how do we resist, segregation and subjugation in the South without getting ourselves killed. And at 19, King graduated with a sociology degree from Morehouse. And he says he resented and was embarrassed by the way that black people practice religion. He said many pastors were unlettered, and King started to intellectualize religious morality in a way that I don't think black people really did before. How do you create a world that reflects religious principles and not just claim to live your life by these principles? How do you apply these principles to a social movement? And King's working through these things as a teenager. So next, King goes to Crozer Seminary, which is a theological seminary and religious school in Upland, Pennsylvania. And he recounts a lot of the other people that influence his thought process there. You got Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, Hobbes, and of course Gandhi. And then there's a guy named Walter Rosenbusch. I think pronouncing that last name right, I might not be. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering it. But Walter Rosenbusch wrote a book called Christianity and the Social Crisis. And this really had a profound effect on the way that King thought about the church's role in society and how we can affect social change. And in the book, King said, any religion that professes concern for the souls of men and is not equally concerned about the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them is a spiritually moribund religion only waiting for the day to be buried. The minister must be both sincere and intelligent. I also think that the minister should possess profundity of conviction. We have too many ministers in the pulpit who are great spellbinders and too few who possess spiritual power, end quote. At this time, King also critiques and renounces communism, specifically Marxism, in a real succinct way. He says, first, I reject their materialistic interpretation of history. Communism, avowed secularistic and materialistic, communism, avowedly secularistic and materialistic, has no place for God. So strike one, he's a Christian. There's no way he's going to buy into a philosophy or a political theology that says that God don't exist. Number two, secondly, I strongly disagree with communism's ethical relativism. Anything, force, violence, murder, lying is justifiable means to the millennial end. And King is already engaging with a thought process that's leading him towards nonviolent resistance. So coming across a philosophy and a theology that encourages violent overthrow of the government or is okay with the violent overthrow of a government if that's the means to get you to a equal and just society. And he's not okay with that. And the third point that he makes is, I oppose communism's political totalitarianism. And he says that man becomes hardly more in communism than a depersonalized cog in the turning wheel of the state. So, under these different regimes, under communist, socialist governments, sometimes the government dictates to people what you can and can't do. So if you want to study art, if you want to study music, philosophy, if you want to be a mechanic, and the government needs you to be a farmer or they need you to be a lab tech or something like that, they'll just take you from your home and put you in a specific job without any regard to what you want to do personally. And King's like, that takes away my personal freedom. It goes against my values and it goes against his religious morals. So for all my socialists and all my Marxists out there, King really didn't fuck with Marxism and socialism or communism for those specific reasons. But he did recognize the merit of striving towards a classless society and for social justice. But how you get there is just as important as getting there. So from Crozer, King goes to Boston University School of Theology. And here we see more seeds of his nonviolent resistance philosophy grow, and with some more influence, this time from something called personalistic philosophy, which has a lot of different definitions, but what was taught at Boston was something called Boston personalism, which affirmed the existence of the soul and taught that each individual had intrinsic value. Also, around this part of the book, King describes how he met his wife, which, man, it's kind of player the way he did it, man. Like, he called one of his friends from Atlanta, asked her to hook him up with somebody in Boston. So she shot him Coretta's number, and he called Coretta like, hey, I heard some good things about you from my homegirl. Can I take you out? And that shit worked, my nigga. Like, I don't know about you. I don't call. I'm never cold called a woman before. You know what I'm saying? I got some good friends, but they at least gonna lay some groundwork for me. You know what I'm saying? We at least gonna meet a couple times before we, hook up and get married. But King just called her, shot his shot, man, and he bagged her. Like, Coretta was pretty, she was light skinned, she was a singer from a big city on the come up, man. Like, basically Beyonce. And King bagged her without even having a job. Like, he was still a college student, man. And like the cliche say, behind every strong man is a strong woman. And had Coretta not, had the fortitude that she had, she might not have been down with the movement. At the first sign of trouble, she would have wanted to get her and her family as far away from danger as possible. And the path that King was on was definitely going to get dangerous. So after graduating from Boston University in 1954, King is offered a job as the head pastor of Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery, Alabama, and after doing, a guest sermon there. So he and Coretta debated, whether or not they should move north, because they didn't, think it was wise maybe to bring their kids up in a racist environment in the South. And Coretta also had her music career to worry about. So that wasn't going to go anywhere in Alabama, and they decided to stay because they felt they can do more good in the segregated South than they could up north. And the first order of business was to change the community's perception of this particular church, this Dexter Avenue Church. King called this sort of a, quote, silk stocking church, end quote. Just like most communities, you got a rich church with people driving Benzes and Audis and all the nice cars with all the nice clothes, and everybody got good jewelry and all that stuff on. And then you got the poor church where the pastor got to get in this van and go pick up half the congregation for the church start, And we always find a way to separate ourselves. And King saw this separation, and instead he wanted to use the church as a means to affect some type of social change. And he says that worship at its best, he says, quote, worship at its best is a social experience with all people of all levels of life coming together to realize their oneness and unity under God, end quote. And after reading that sentence from him, I wondered, if King thought that the protests were like a form of religious expression, like an act of worship, divinely inspired. Like, I gotta do this if I'm a God-fearing, God-loving man. I gotta correct this wrong that I see. So anyway, next we see an example of the cream rising to the top, so to speak. Like, after being offered the pastorship at Dexter Avenue Church and starting to organize the members there and really work in the community, he becomes the secretary of the local NAACP. And then the vice president of the Alabama Council on Human Rights. And during all this, King says, quote, I continued to study hard as usual. I rose every morning at 5:30 and spent 3 hours writing the thesis, returning to it late at night for another 3 hours, end quote. King is maybe 25 at this time? Like, what were you doing at 25, man? He putting in this much work not to become a leader, not to become the civil rights leader, but to become more effective at his job. He really wanted to understand his thoughts around this nonviolent movement that was kind of brewing in his head. And they gave him these leadership positions just because he was capable of that. He put in the work to make himself capable, So the Montgomery boycott begins after he takes on the leadership roles of all these different organizations down there in Montgomery. And of course, we know the story of how the boycott started. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man. She's eventually arrested for violating segregation laws. And in response, King and his people organized this boycott, refusing to ride any buses until several demands are met. And I'll talk a little bit about those demands later. But the most interesting thing about this chapter is that King questions the morality of this campaign, which is mind-blowing because I don't think we question the morality of our current, call-out culture, of our cancel culture. We just quick to, hop on Twitter, hop in somebody comments and destroy him without considering whether or not that's even useful to the situation. So he questions, whether they're just as bad as this white nationalist group called the White Citizens Council. And they used boycotting and other methods to terrorize black people. This White Citizens Council did. They terrorized black people and white people who did business with black folks or supported ideas like desegregation and interracial marriage and all of that stuff. But King decides that they must continue because, quote, our concern is not to put the bus company out of business, but to put the justice in business. I came to see that what we were really doing was withdrawing our cooperation from an evil system rather than merely withdrawing our support from the bus company. The bus company, being an external expression of the system, would naturally suffer. But the basic aim was to refuse to cooperate with evil. I conceived of our moment as an act of massive non-cooperation. From then on, I rarely used the word boycott, end quote. And King was surprised at the people's determination to finish the boycott. Their willingness and ability to suffer. I mean, people walked, they carpooled, they took cabs, gave each other piggyback rides, anything but get on that bus. And King motivated every black person in the city of Montgomery to do this, not just his church. And the interesting thing from this period is when King describes, the white people's response to the boycott, because all these people, they wanted their maids, they wanted their nannies, they wanted their cooks at the house on time each morning. So what you gonna do in that situation? It's like, did you hear the Negroes ain't riding the bus? Shit, I'm gonna go get him. These underwear ain't gonna wash themselves. You understand? So King talks about King tells the story of an old housemaid and the lady she worked for, and the lady asked her, what she thought about the boycott. And the old housemaid was like, I just told my youngest all this type of stuff is white folks' business, and we just gonna stay off the bus till they get it settled and worked out. Slick. So of course, it wouldn't be easy. Of course, it wasn't going to be easy to change a system of segregation that was like hundreds of years old, man. No, of course, the city leaders and the business owners and the bus drivers wasn't having that with King. So as the people got better and more comfortable not riding the buses, for the first time, the bus companies, they came to the table. And what King and the movement asked for were, 1, courteous treatment, 2, first come, first serve when it comes to seating on the bus, and 3, black drivers, drive black routes. That's it. And the city's response was, yeah, you know what, that all sounds good, totally understandable, but it's illegal. We can't do that. All that stuff you asked for is totally illegal, man. And they didn't stop there, man. They started rumors that King and Coretta bought new cars for the family, man, and tried to divide and conquer by starting another rumor that the boycott had actually been stopped. The white folks down there in Montgomery said that they had spoke with city leaders and they had came to an agreement. And King and them was like, hold on, no, that's a lie, that's a fabrication. And they were so plugged in with the community, they went out to the pool halls, they went out to the clubs, they went everywhere and let folks know, like, that's some BS, man, the boycott is still on. And somehow the city got to the insurance companies that the black drivers and the cab companies were using and made them drop all the black people in Montgomery. King and his followers had to find new insurance companies or they wouldn't be able to provide rides for each other, man. Them some dirty motherfuckers. But of course, they did find new insurance companies for the drivers, but that was before they arrested King for speeding because, like I said, the white folks that ran Montgomery wasn't going out like that. They were petty and they were willing to do whatever it took to get rid of this man. They threatened King. They called his home. They threatened his wife and his kids. And eventually they did bomb his house because the black people in Montgomery wanted to be treated with respect when they rode the bus. They wanted to be able to sit at an open seat and maybe have somebody that looked like them drive the bus when they was going to work in the morning. They bombed his house because he convinced thousands of black people not to spend money on a racist bus system. And when you fuck with the money, they get nasty, man. And around this time, King says, quote, "A member of my church came to me one day and solemnly suggested that it would be to our advantage to kill off 8 or 10 white people. This is the only language these white folks will understand," he said. "If we fail to do this, they'll think we're afraid. You must show them we are afraid no longer," end quote. Which, you can't say you blame the guy, but that's not what this movement is about. And even after that bombing and the sabotage and the calls for violence from his own congregation, King urges everybody stay calm. We not gonna commit any violence on my behalf. Just stick to the plan. This boycott. And in February of 1956, Montgomery County grand jury started handing out indictments, more than 100 indictments, with King included, for violating the anti-boycott laws. And they threatened to send over 100 people to prison for not riding the bus. And at the time of the indictment, King was out of town, so he knew that if he went back to Montgomery, he was going to be arrested. And they probably tried to take his life again. So what does he do? He goes back to Atlanta, see his wife and his family. He took his ass back down to Montgomery, like, yeah, let's get it popping. What y'all want to do, man? Yeah, he made his bond, and he took that shit to trial like a G, man. And they found him guilty. Yeah, $500 fine plus court costs, or 386 days in prison, hard labor. Now, they're doing all of this to try to break King, to show him we'll make your life hell, man. We'll come up with any charge we can. We'll try to kill you. We'll harass you. We'll arrest you, bomb your friends, congregation, your followers. We'll just get back on that damn bus, And what does King do after being found guilty? Of course, he's like, hey, we still out here, baby. We boycott, I imagine King coming out of that courtroom like Tupac. You remember Tupac got found guilty, he had the bandana in his head, he was spitting at the camera and all that shit. King got the M down for Montgomery. Okay, maybe that's a little bit too much. But what I'm trying to say is he was committed to this thing, no matter the consequence. And at this point in the book, he says, quote, "Let's not fool ourselves. We haven't reached the promised land yet, north or south. We still confront segregation in the South in its glaring, conspicuous forms. We still confront the North in its subtle and hidden forms. Segregation is still a fact. Now, it might be true that old man segregation is on his deathbed, but history has proven that social systems have a great last-minute breathing power, and the guardians of the status quo are always on hand with their oxygen tents to keep the old order alive." Huh? End quote. Sound familiar? Like right when you think racism, bigotry, xenophobia, all of that stuff is dead, here comes a new generation with tiki torches that like the cross in my front yard. Like, now I don't know how much resolve you have, but I know I would have a hard time dealing with the city of Montgomery, man. In November 1956, about 9 months after King was found guilty of anti-boycott laws, the city took legal action against the carpools. Like, nah, y'all can't be chauffeuring each other around like this on this old school Uber shit. Nah, y'all can't do that. So King and them had to take the city to court, a fairly racist court, obviously, to try to convince them to let black folks in Montgomery give each other rides, man. That's crazy. And I didn't tell you, like, all of this, what King and his people were doing in Alabama, is a big fucking deal. Like, national media, newspapers, TV stations from like all around the country and the world are tuning in to what's going on in Alabama, because the whole world kind of know that America doesn't fuck with black people. And while King is having these hearings to allow the carpool to take place, he hears a bunch of commotion going on in the back of the courtroom. And a reporter from the Associated Press slipped King a note that says the U.S. Supreme Court declared all Alabama state and local bus segregation laws unconstitutional. And at which point, I would have kind of been like, man, fuck this court proceeding, nigga, we won. But no, they had to stay and actually finish their proceedings on the carpooling thing. And the city ruled, yeah, that carpooling shit's still illegal. Y'all can get on the bus now and do what y'all want, but y'all still can't carpool. That's petty, man. But King won his first real battle. They tried to kill him, but he won. And that's why I think of this story like a great general on a campaign, going from city to city and sacking them like Hannibal and like Caesar did back in the day. Like they would roll up on a city, they would surround it, and they would put pressure on it. They would bomb it. They would send fire bombs, arrows, soldiers. They would cut them off from the outside world so they couldn't just get supplies. And they would just squeeze these cities, man, until the people capitulated and gave them what they wanted. And that's almost what King was doing back in the day. And you'll see this pattern, man. He'll go from city to city to city, set up shop, and put in work and get exactly what he wanted out of them. Look, we gonna boycott, we gonna march, we gonna do these sit-ins, we gonna pray, and y'all gonna lock us up and do whatever y'all want to us, but at the end of the day, you gonna capitulate. At this time, King is elected the head of the Christian Leadership Conference, and that's a network of Christian organizations in the South that is committed to social and racial change. So he has hundreds and thousands of people he can now mobilize and organize to whatever ends he wants. And he's famous, like big famous. And he recognizes this fame and he says, quote, "When you are aware that you are a symbol, it causes you to search your soul constantly, to go through this job of self-analysis to see if you live up to the high and noble principles that people surround you with. And try at all times to keep the gulf between the public self and the private self at a minimum," end quote. Like, King's maybe 26, 27 around this time. Like, how old is Meek Mill? Like, his response to injustice is interesting because he'd been to jail before. Like, they just let Meek out, for popping willies. Now, there's a difference when you're guilty, when you've actually done something wrong. I mean, it sucks, but it's part of you kind of accepts that, okay, this is a natural consequence of what I've been doing. Like if you've been trapping or if you and did some dirt and you get caught up for it, even if you get caught for something else, you kind of like, well, this is part of the game. But when you didn't do it, you start to see the system and this injustice and the society for like how ugly it can really be, man. And sometimes something in you says, I gotta push back against that, This shouldn't be here. This ain't right, this ugliness. So what's important to look at here, too, is that King believed in the system in a way that I don't think we do today. I mean, he was in touch with almost every administration, whether it was Republican or Democrat. Like, hey, I read the Constitution, and it said y'all ain't supposed to be treating us like this. And he was willing to use the court system as well as protests and boycotts and other methods to get the job done. And he had faith in the system. He had faith that it was intrinsically good, inherently good, and that it could work if it lived up to the ideals of equality, justice, and so on. But the most important part of Black folks' participation in that system was the vote. And on a visit to Washington, D.C., King said, quote, "Our most urgent request to the President of the United States and every member of Congress is to give us the right to vote. Give us the ballot and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot and we will no longer plead to the federal government for passage of an anti-lynching law. We will, by the power of our vote, write the law on the statute books of the South and bring an end to the dastardly acts of the hooded perpetrators of violence. Give us the vote and we will transform the salient misdeeds of bloodthirsty mobs into the calculated good deeds of orderly citizens. Give us the ballot and we will fill our legislative halls with men of goodwill and send to the sacred halls of Congress men who will not sign a Southern manifesto because of their devotion to the manifesto of justice. Give us the ballot, and we will place judges on the benches of the South who will do justly and love mercy. And we will place at the head of the Southern states governors who have felt not only the tinge of human, but the glow of the divine. Give us the ballot, and we will quietly and non-violently, without rancor or bitterness, implement the Supreme Court's decision of May 17th, 1954, end quote. You remember that speech he gave when he was 14? Like, his tune really didn't change after all this, right? Like, I read the Constitution. It says we're better than this, that you are better than this. So what y'all trying to do? So in the mid to late 50s, man, King is a public intellectual and international celebrity. He's in Ghana, he in Nigeria, he in London, France, all over the place, man, explaining his thesis. You remember that thesis he was working on? 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon. He got him around the world. That thesis on nonviolent resistance to racism and oppression. And he was there in Ghana when they gained their independence from the British. And I can't say he was feeling himself, because King doesn't really present himself that way. But let's just say the campaign was in full swing. He won the bus segregation battle in Alabama. He wrote the book about the boycott, and he's giving speeches all around the world. I mean, if he would have dropped the album at that time, he probably would have went platinum, man. He was popping like that. So in 1958, King's on his world tour, giving speeches, kissing babies, signing books, campaigning, and he's at an apartment in Harlem signing books. And King says everything's going well. He's doing his thing. And some woman walks up to him and asks, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And he says he ain't even look up. He was just like, "Yeah." And that's me. And boom, this lady stabs him in the chest. She poked him, bro. Like, coming into this, I knew he had been arrested and maybe roughed up in a couple marches and gave his big speeches, right? But I didn't know that they blew his house up and some sister stabbed him. Some sister named Zola Ware stabbed him in the chest, man. Like, he was constantly having to be vigilant, man. He constantly had to appeal to presidents, had to appeal to local authorities, to his congregation, to black people in general. He was really going through it, man. But, in normal Martin Luther King fashion, he didn't lose faith. He didn't change his behavior. He simply urged his congregation, to keep with the struggle for freedom and for justice. And so a few months after his stabbing in New York, King is back on his world tour, baby. And this time he visits India, the birthplace of one of his largest influences, Mahatma Gandhi. And apparently the newspapers had did a real good job spreading the story of the Montgomery bus boycotts, because they were big news there in India. And King says that the papers there in India gave a better account of the struggle than the papers back home. But despite this warm welcome in India, King was put off by the extreme poverty there, and in particular the treatment of this group of people called the Untouchables. Now, if you're not familiar with India, the Untouchables are another example of human beings' ability to find a way to separate themselves and delineate ourselves from one another. And in America, it's easy to separate black from white. The differences between us are obvious. But in India, they had developed a caste system that deemed more than like 100 million people to be less than human, a subspecies. And these people were abused, they were oppressed, forced down in a way that shows just how bad it can get when an entire society agrees that a certain group of people aren't even deserving of acknowledging their humanity. Man, here in America, there were splits in society as to what to do with the Africans once they were freed from slavery. And even before that, some people were okay with slavery, some people tolerated it but wouldn't own slave themselves. Some people hated slavery but didn't want the Africans here in this country, and then other people thought that the Africans should be freed from slavery and integrated into society. And these risks were here from the beginning, from the founding of this country. I mean, they put these two conflicting statements in our own Constitution that says that all men are created equal on one hand, but the black man is 3/5 of a person on the other hand, which is some bullshit. But hey, at least it's more than half, and it's more than what the Indian upper class gave to the Untouchables. Compare that happened here in America with over 2,000 years of thinking that a certain group of people who look just like you aren't really people. They ain't even human. Then being told out of nowhere that you got to treat these people with respect and dignity now. The Indian government had to add anti-discrimination amendments to its constitution in the 1950s. And that's almost 20 years before we did it here in the U.S. And then in the 80s, they had to add specific laws saying that you couldn't rape these people, you can't abuse these people, you can't murder them with impunity. Like, you can't just take their land or parade them naked through the streets and make them eat shit for your own amusement. Like, what they did in India to these folks was just despicable. But this is, again, it's over 2,000 years of hatred and bigotry and oppression to a certain group of people. And in 1959, King was there, and he was like, "Man, I don't like this shit. What is y'all doing? Like, what did Gandhi die for?" And well, I'll tell you what Gandhi died for. The same reason that King was eventually killed, for trying to get people to give up those prejudices and that hatred. And a little while after King came back from India, he gives a sermon on his time there in India, and this is what he says. Quote, "One of his own fellow Hindus felt that he was a little too favorable toward the Muslims, felt that he was giving too much for the Muslims. Here was a man of nonviolence falling at the hands of a man of violence. He was a man of loving. Here was a man of love fall into the hands of a man with hate. This seems the way of history. End quote. That's like eerily prophetic, right? Like, does that scenario sound familiar? Do you think that while he was giving that sermon that he thought, yeah, this probably gonna happen to me? Yeah, somebody probably gonna shoot me for what I'm doing. I mean, he did watch Malcolm X die after Malcolm X returned from Mecca. And Malcolm X changed his rhetoric on violent opposition to white people and white supremacy, and started to think more universally of humanity. They killed him for that. So King comes back from India with a little more perspective on the aftermath of a nonviolent revolution. Like, while he's encouraged by the power of love, he's starting to see that there's more to it than just racial justice, equality. People need jobs. They need to be safe. They need housing. They need to be propped up against the downside of capitalism. This isn't the language he used, but his actions with unions and housing issues in the North shows that King was definitely thinking bigger than just desegregation in the South, and maybe going to India and seeing how extreme poverty and that caste system reminded him of the Great Depression when he was younger. Injustice and inequality can manifest themselves in many other ways than just along racial lines. So King moves back to Atlanta to become the co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church and to direct. So in 1960, King moves back to Atlanta to become the co-pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church and to direct Southwide campaigns for the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So white folks still fucking with him though. And the state of Alabama arrested and charged him with falsifying tax documents from 1956 and from 1958. So during this whole trial, King is nervous, like, man, they about to bang me, because the entire court system is white. The judge is white, the jury's white, the prosecutor's white, the state's witness is white, the bailiffs is white, the janitor's white, everybody's white. And the state of Alabama has been trying to get this man for years. So he yeah, this is it, man. And this part of the book is kind of confusing too, because King writes that he was indicted for perjury, but the notes inside the book say that he was indicted for tax evasion. But at any rate, he was acquitted by an all-white jury after 3 days in court. And he credits his acquittal to 2 black attorneys he imported from Chicago and from New York, William Ming and Herbert Delaney. So this is remarkable because, remember, this is 1960s Alabama. They'll kill you for marching across a bridge. They bombed King's house. They killed white people who traveled to Montgomery to support the bus cow. So they'll lie on a stand, the jury is corrupt. So King had no reason to think otherwise. So the fact that these 2 brothers came down here, what they would think of as upending Negroes from the South, because that was the feeling towards educated blacks at the time. They can come down there and convince even them that the charges were bullshit. That was amazing. And also around this time, black students were starting to do sit-ins at college campuses around the South. And this is a spontaneous thing that was born, King says, because of the bus boycott inspiring people around the country to start similar movements. King says almost every Negro had experienced the tragic inconveniences of lunch counter segregation. He could not understand why he was welcomed with open arms at most counters in the store, but was denied service in a certain counter because it happened to be selling food and drink. In a real sense, the sit-in represented more than a demand for service. It represented a demand for respect, end quote. That's a strange situation to be in, right? I can spend my money here with you, but I can't get a sandwich. That's a subtle reminder that the larger society that you live in just don't want you around. You're only tolerated. But King also says our ultimate aim was not to defeat or humiliate the white man, but win his friendship and understanding. We had a moral obligation to remind him that segregation is wrong. We protested with the ultimate aim of being reconciled with our white brothers, end quote. And that brings me to one of the main criticisms, if you could criticize such a thing, of the civil rights movement, which is that we fought for the right to give white folks our money and to shop in their stores and to ride their buses and to just be in their presence. And I don't think that was the right tactic to take. Or I don't think that's the right way to think about it. But if you do look at, certain metrics like the black family structure, the rates of marriage, unemployment, education rate, we do seem to be doing worse since desegregation since the civil rights movement. But of course, the civil rights movement was about more than just shopping with white folks, spending money with white folks. It was about voting rights. It was about fair housing. It was about police brutality. It was about protecting us from terrorism from the Klan. But the strategy for dealing with those things meant that we had to get their attention through economics, through commerce. You had to fuck with the money. Look, y'all ain't listening. We've been asking y'all to treat us right. We've been praying, singing, we shall overcome. Hold on. How about we stop spending money with you motherfuckers? Will you listen now? And it worked. So I already mentioned that King was open to communicating with both sides of the aisle of the political landscape. But by 1960, King was heavily involved with the sit-in movement. So while he was conducting these sit-ins in Atlanta, King, along with 280-some students, were arrested for violating the segregation laws. But before that, he had been in communication with Richard Nixon, who was the vice president to Dwight Eisenhower at the time, and Senator Jack Kennedy. He was talking to Senator Jack Kennedy as well, and they were both running for president, Kennedy and Nixon. So King had been meeting with presidents, vice presidents, presidential candidates to get their support for a civil rights bill. And Kennedy seemed to be the only one who was really, receptive to getting that legislation through. And most white leaders could admit that segregation was bad, but few were willing to get their political careers, or few of them were willing to put their political careers on the line to rectify that problem. So while King was in jail for the sit-in in DeKalb County, the sheriff or whatever tells him, hey, you got a warrant for not changing your license over from an Alabama license to a Georgia license. And once the charges were dropped against, him and the 280-some students for the sit-in, he still got 6 months of hard labor in prison to do because of this traffic violation. But anyway, while all this is going on, people are getting in touch with Kennedy and Nixon like, hey, man, you got to come do something about this. Like, they ain't trying to let us talk to him. They trying to give him all of this time, and they won't let us bond him out. And Nixon is quiet because he's running for president, and he doesn't want to get involved with these radical black people. Kennedy, on the other hand, calls out to the prison after King is transferred in the middle of the night from DeKalb County to prison. It's like, what the fuck is going on? Why can't they bond him out? Like, why ain't he got a bond? And the next day, King is released. Like, oh shit, Jack Kennedy called. He run for president. Let me fall back. And 2 weeks later, JFK is elected the 37th president of the United States with a lot of support from the black community. And we've pretty much been voting Democrat ever since. So Nixon played King and lost the election because of it. Maybe. And here was what King had to say about what Nixon did. Quote, I had known Nixon longer. He had been supposedly close to me. He would call me frequently about things, seeking my advice. And yet, when this moment came, it was like he had never heard of me. So this is why I really considered him a moral coward and one who was unwilling to take a courageous step and take a risk. I'm convinced that he lost the election because of that. Many Negroes were still on the fence, still undecided, and they were leaning towards Nixon. End quote. Shots fired. Moral coward is 1960 civil rights speech for bitch ass nigga, by the way. Moral coward. So, you remember at the beginning of this thing, I said, think of King like a general of a nonviolent army, and to treat each one of these episodes, each one of these incidents as if they were a war campaign, right? So first he started his training at the different seminaries and universities as a young man, as a teenager, honing his skills. Then he had his first major battle in Montgomery where they bombed his house. And then he had that battle in Atlanta with the sit-ins, which King admits that he didn't start, but he was a part of. But his next big battle is in a place called Albany, Georgia. And King described Albany as, quote, a distillation of tensions and conflicts straining the social fabric of a contemporary South, end quote. Man, I wish King rapped. Like, his bars and his vocabulary was so expansive. I'm trying to get my bars and my vocabulary up like that, but just the way that he uses languages. Like, pay attention when I quote him throughout this book, because the way that he puts words together is impressive on a bunch of levels, but it's almost poetic. And people recognize this and they talk about it a lot. But yeah, pay attention to the way that he speaks and the way that he strings words together, man. That reflects how sharp and concise his mind was. Like, the better and clearer you think, the better you write. And the better you write, the clearer and more precisely you can think. That's just a little bit of game for you. So anyway, translation, Albany was super, super racist. Like, black people couldn't do shit in his town. The schools were segregated, the parks were segregated, the libraries, the buses, the restaurants, everything was segregated, and the people weren't even allowed to vote. And it just amazed me, the level of petty that white folks were able to accomplish in this era, man. I mean, you got to be a level 11.5 bitch ass nigga to be like, yeah, you can't use this water fountain right here. Like, you got to use that rusty one over there. Like, huh, man, I'm thirsty. You mean tell me? I mean, that don't even make sense. You pressing a button that shoot water into the air. Like, you don't want to press the same fucking button as me? That is petty. That's superbly petty. That's super petty and racist. So in 1961, King and a man named Dr. W.G. Anderson, who was already heading the protest movement in Albany, decided to stage a march to protest the mad levels of pettiness or murderous segregation, whichever one you prefer. Dr. Anderson had already been doing sit-ins, jail-ins, deal-ins, boycotts, legal actions, lawsuits, breakdance competitions, and whatever already in Albany. And he was getting busy before King already got there. And the white folks were tired of this shit. They tired of these niggas. So the city just made everything illegal. No sit-ins, no marches, no protests, no barbershop quartets, nigga, nothing. Stay your ass at home. And I imagine it had to be like, a subtle martial law where only half of the town had a curfew. 27,000 black people in this town were living under a different type of apartheid. And a bunch of them showed up that day in December and were arrested with King and Dr. Anderson. And after a few days in jail, refusing to spend money with the local businesses, Christmas was coming up. And the merchants and the business owners wanted that black dollar. So what they do, they called the city leaders and told them, look, man, we need to negotiate, work something out. It wasn't worth the financial blow to put this movement down, not before Christmas. So everybody's let out of jail so people can go shopping, and the city promises to desegregate the toilets and all of that shit. So everything's looking promising, right? But of course, these people are petty. The city violated the agreement with the protesters, and the charges were not dropped. And King and his people went back to protesting and back to jail. And they stayed in jail for so long that the sheriff had to trick King and his people out and lied to him and told him that somebody actually paid their bond, because the longer they stayed in jail, the longer and more intense the protest got. And a couple of weeks after King was released, the police assaulted a group of him and protesters. They came, one of his lawyers, and they beat a pregnant woman. And he says that while all this was going on, some brothers weren't part of the demonstration, started throwing rocks and bottles at the police, and the situation kind of got out of hand. And King had to put a temporary cease to the protest. But once he was sure that everybody was committed to nonviolence, even the people who weren't participating in the protest, they hosted another demonstration, and this time they did a prayer vigil in front of City Hall. And as you can imagine, they got arrested again swiftly. And when King and Ralph Abernathy were arrested this time in late July, they decided, yo, we gonna stay in jail. You're not gonna trick us out this time. And this was all part of the strategy, because, the whole time they were going to court for all these little offenses, disturbing the peace, blocking the pavement, assembling without permission. I mean, stupid, petty charges. They're also trying to find King and the rest of the protesters, and offering to let them out of jail. Like, hey, pay the fine, we'll let you out, man. Y'all get back to marching, preaching, whatever y'all want to do. And that's where the strategy comes in, because by refusing to pay the fine and by refusing to admit guilt, they're also making jail irrelevant as a consequence. I mean, if you tell me you're going to throw me in jail and I tell you come on with it, we're going to be in here singing, having prayer services, and I'm running the movement from the jail like El Chapo or something, like, how long can you keep that up? How long can you keep arresting me, beating me, hosing me? It just won't work. Jailing me won't work. In some states, witnesses, probably a sheriff's deputy, would get on the stand and lie and say that they were keeping the peace during trial. Like, that's why you were beating a pregnant woman over the head, but that's not going to stop us. But during this period of protest in Albany, his old friend, Jack Kennedy, called and issued a statement saying that the city should sit down with these folks, and work something out. Old relationships paid off. So despite, no intervention from the federal government aside from that call from Jack Kennedy, which was what King really wanted, he wanted that federal intervention. The city of Albany dropped all charges against him and the other protesters. And after after weeks and months of trials and jailings and violent resistance to desegregation, they voted to repeal all of the city's desegregation laws, even the library. But in typical petty ass fashion, they did it on a 30-day trial basis. So yeah, we're gonna open up the library, but we're gonna desegregate it for just 30 days, just see how this all works out, make sure that nothing come up missing. Just insulting petty motherfuckers. So if Albany was a bad place for brothers to be in the 1960s, then Birmingham is much worse, much meaner, bigger brother. King says, quote, "You have found a general atmosphere of violence and brutality in Birmingham. Local racists intimidated, mobbed, and even killed Negroes with impunity. One of the more vivid examples of the terror of Birmingham was the castration of a Negro man whose mutilated body had been abandoned on a lonely road. No Negro home was protected from bombings and burnings. From the year 1957 to January 1963, while Birmingham was still claiming that its Negroes were satisfied, 17 unsolved bombings of churches and homes of civil rights leaders occurred." End quote. He goes on to call Birmingham the most segregated city in America and the largest city of a police state led by a man named George Wallace, the governor, who made a pledge of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. You racist motherfucker. And in Birmingham, King's main opposition was a man by the name of Bull Connor. I think this was like his most famous opponent. It was like the only opposition that he gave a lot of time to. And like George Wallace, Connor was a deeply racist guy and was committed to segregation at all costs. And also, like Wallace, Connor had a lot of power in Birmingham. See, Bull Connor was elected to something called the Commission of Public Safety, which is a committee that still exists in Birmingham to this day. And this commission has control over the fire department, the police department, the emergency services. And with Bull Connor at the head of it, who had already let a group of freedom riders be assaulted by the Klan, and who kept black folks from voting at the polls in Birmingham, and who had closed a bunch of parks and other public places rather than let them be integrated when the federal government told them it was illegal to have all those things segregated. And just his, overall propensity for violence, you see how it'd be just a matter of time before him and King and the movement have a violent head-to-head. And in Birmingham, just like in Albany, there are already people on the ground putting in work, dealing with Bull Connor and the other racist officials in that city, man. And in this case, is a guy by the name of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. And after the Montgomery bus boycott, he formed a group called the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights and joined the SCLC as one of his 80-some-odd affiliates. And boy, did Shuttlesworth go through it, man. Maybe more than King up until now, I mean, King was murdered, but spoiler for the folks who don't know that he dies at the end. But in 56, King says his house was bombed. Shuttlesworth's house was bombed, completely destroyed. His church was bombed. His wife was mobbed and beaten up. He was arrested and thrown in jail at least 8 times during those freedom rides. So in effect, King already had a battle-hardened lieutenant there waiting for him in Birmingham when he got there. And in this chapter, this is where I start to see the idea of King as a general kind of emerge, because he starts to use the type of language himself. Like he says about recruiting volunteers for his nonviolent army, quote, "We proved to them that we needed no weapons, not so much as a toothpick. We proved that we possessed the most formidable weapon of all, the conviction that we were right," end quote. And he goes on to say, quote, "We did not hesitate to call our movement an army. It was a special army with no supplies but its sincerity, no uniform but its determination, no arsenal except its faith, no currency but its conscience. It was an army that would not move. It was an army that would move but not maul. It was an army that would sing but not slay," end quote. So if he's thinking of this movement as an army, what does that make him other than a general commanding hundreds of thousands of black folks across the South? The SCLC has 85 different affiliates. So in effect, King has 85 different units under his command, right? And you can call these 85 different regions for resources, for money, for people, if you need them. And that's what made him and other civil rights leaders at the time so powerful and so dangerous to the white power structure, both North and South. His ability to organize, their ability to organize massive, large-scale organizations that spanned states, all throughout the country. But, in Army, has to have his tactics, its strategies for success. And King's army was no different. So, like he said, his army didn't have munitions, they didn't have uniforms, they didn't have bombs or weapons. But what they did have was sit-ins, kneel-ins at churches, marches, and voter registration drives. And that's what they set out to do in Birmingham. This is their offensive. So what do you do when they say that everything, all of your weapons are illegal, and the state, starts to issue injunctions supporting the city? And the state Supreme Court starts to issue injunctions supporting the city. Because up until this point, the courts have eventually sided with King and the protesters. But now they got a choice to make, accept the injunction or break the law. And King ain't no punk, man. He say, fuck it, we gonna just go ahead and keep marching. Y'all say we can't do it, that's immoral, that's not right, we just gonna keep it moving. So after making a conscious decision to break the law, King and the movement get more bad news. The company that was providing the bail for everybody won't be able to continue because the city determined the company didn't have enough funds to bond people out. So they couldn't operate in that area anymore. And this is a big deal because King and his people don't have the money to bail out all those volunteers out of jail. But, when you have a bail bondsman, he can put up the collateral, or you can put up the collateral, and he can use, the funds available to him to get those people out of jail. So without any idea of how or when you're going to get out of jail, you might start losing volunteers to get locked up. You might not be able to demonstrate because nobody wants to show up if it means that I'm going to go to jail and just get thrown in there forever. And most importantly, King's friends and supporters didn't want him to go on the march because, well, he's the leader. And if you get arrested and you can't get bailed out, that's a major blow to the movement. But King decides he got to march anyway. And he's arrested just like he thought he would be. And when Bull Connor and his men arrest King, they don't throw him in with the general population. No, they isolate him from both the people in jail and the people outside for like 24 hours, which may not seem like a big deal to us now, but at the time, remember, they could just kill you, on some backwater county jail shit. Like, oh, he committed suicide, or he had an allergic reaction to the food and he died in here, or, oh, no, he had an altercation with, another inmate and he was killed. Any number of horrible things can happen to a black person in jail. And to be a desegregationist was even more dangerous. And this is even before Sandra Bland and we got cameras. Like, and if we're thinking that, if we're thinking of King as a general in a war for justice or whatever, like letting yourself be captured by your enemy regularly ain't a good strategy, in my opinion. But when they place him in solitude for 24 hours, incommunicado, Coretta wasn't having that. Like, she knew what they was trying to do and what they could do to her husband in jail with no one around to witness. So what does she do? She reaches out to the president, She calls his brother, Robert Kennedy, who's the attorney general at the time. And he calls her back, like, hey, what's going on? And she explains, like, look, they got him held up, won't let me talk to him, and I don't know where he at. So he say, hold on, let me call my brother, the president. They got the homie locked up. And a few hours later, the president himself calls Coretta back, let her know, look, I got this. Let me make a couple phone calls. And he calls to Birmingham. And King says after that, quote, after the president's intervention, conditions changed considerably, end quote. And he was on the phone with Coretta a little while after that. If there was ever a testimony as to, why you need a strong woman by your side, that's it. Like, I can't imagine any of the other people on King's team wanted to call the president, but they was like, I don't want to bother him. He's the president. He just got elected. There's a lot going on. But Coretta was like, fuck that. Where the phone at? Yeah, call him. Hey, Jack. Yeah, they won't let me talk to my baby. Where he at? And he made that call. So, but King was still, he still had the problem of having to raise money to bail himself out. And this was part of the civil rights movement I had to take for granted as well until reading this biography. But Harry Belafonte was a major fundraiser and contributed to the civil rights movement. Really, a lot of celebrities were, like Marlon Brando, Elizabeth Taylor. It was big time white folks back in the day. But Belafonte was one of a main group of 6 black celebrities who included Sidney Poitier, Sammy Davis Jr., who a lot of black folks considered Uncle Tom, but he gave thousands of dollars for the movement. Dick Gregory, Ozzie Davis, and Ruby Dee were major contributors and movers during the civil rights movement as celebrities at the time. And when King went to jail without any way of knowing how he was going to get out, Harry Belafonte got on the phone in New York and raised $50,000 for the movement, which makes me think, like, besides Colin Kaepernick, Jay-Z and LeBron James now, how many of our celebrities are really out there putting in that level of work for black folks? Probably a lot more than I can think of right now, but, I'm just kind of going off the top of my head. So anyway, so while King is in jail waiting for, the funds for him and his people to get bailed out, he gets a hold of a newspaper, or whether it's slipped to him by one of the sheriffs there or whatever. He gets this newspaper, and in it he sees an advertisement taken out by 8 clergymen, pastors, bishop, ministers, whatever, criticizing King and the other demonstrators. And the advertisement called them extremists. It called them anarchists and a bunch of other stuff, basically just shitting on King and the movement. I got a link to the letter they wrote on my website, and you should read it. And what made it so bad is they weren't just anybody making these criticisms, talking shit about King and the movement. They were religious leaders, which gave them a little more weight against King, who was himself, a religious leader. And this has kind of helped him so far, being a pastor, being a reverend, being a holy man. But when you got other holy men talking shit about you, they are attempting to take away some of his religious credibility, because these other religious people are calling him an anarchist now. But these guys really got the King, and he felt, compelled to answer. And this is how he gets this famous letter from Birmingham. And he starts out with a letter by pretty much saying, look, I don't normally do this, but y'all gonna get this word. And then he commences to go in on these clergymen, who took shots at him and the movement. And he told them, look, I'm here because I'm the president of the SCLC, and our affiliates are in need of our assistance. There is no benefit to me coming here and pointing out the racial injustices of this place. And we don't take these steps lightly. We assess the situation in Birmingham. And Birmingham is, quote, probably the most segregated city in the United States. Its ugly record of brutality is widely known. Negroes have experienced grossly unjust treatment in the courts. There have been unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than in any other city. And these are hard, brutal facts of the case, end quote. He goes on to say these people lied to us. They completely harassed us, jailed us. So if our protests create attention, then so be it, King says. I'm not afraid of the word tension, end quote. And if you look at the letter these clergymen wrote to King, it was the type of stuff that you expect from a scared, moderate people who don't want to rock the boat, who don't want the Negroes, who want the Negroes to be patient, to wait, to handle this issue in the courts. And King says, quote, we have waited for more than 340 years for our constitutional and God-given rights. The nations of Asia and Africa are moving with jet-like speed towards gaining political independence, but we still creep at horse and buggy pace towards gaining a cup of coffee at a lunch counter. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait, but when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse and kick and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you have seen vast majority of 20 million Negro brothers and sisters smothering in an outright cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you have suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why you can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she is told that the fun time is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness towards white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who was asking daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? When you take a cross-country drive and find it necessary to sleep night after night in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile because no motel would accept you. When you are humiliated day in and day out by nagging signs reading white and colored. When your first name becomes nigger, your middle name becomes boy, however old you are, and your last name becomes John, and your wife and mother are never given respected titles like Miss. When you are harried by day and haunted by night by the fact that you are a Negro living constantly at tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next. and are plagued with inner fears and outer resentment, when you are forever fighting the degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait, end quote. And he goes on like this and lists all the grievances that black people have as a result of this oppression and segregation. And he calls them out for condemning the police department for not using violence during the demonstrations. I mean, it's a long letter. And King even says, I didn't mean to write a letter so long, but he had to let him know, you motherfuckers is tripping. A threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, motherfucker. You might want to check your faith if you're okay with what's going on down here. And so King and Abernathy are released after about 8 days in jail and determine they have to get right back to demonstrations. But this time they need a new strategy. And it seems that maybe, people are becoming desensitized to the brutality that's going on throughout the South. And like a lot of wars, when things start to get desperate and you start to run out of troops, you start to dig and dip into your younger generation and you conscript child soldiers to your army. And General King is no different. And him and Abernathy thought it might be a good idea to involve junior high and high school students in an upcoming demonstration to add a dramatic new dimension to the movement. And if you're feeling some type of way about, this child soldier analogy, you're not alone, man. There's a lot of people who criticize King and the demonstrators for, quote, using, unquote, children in this way. And the people were, perhaps justified in their apprehensions of King using kids, because in May 2nd of 1963, 1,000 students showed up to a demonstration, and that's the day that Bull Connor decides that he doesn't want to be nonviolent with the protesters anymore, and had his men club, hose, and sick dogs on those kids and the students and the demonstrators when they showed up to protest that day. And even with Bull Connor's, violent resistance to change, King notices that the white people and the police in Birmingham are starting to become, less aggressive towards the demonstrators. Where like a year before, they'd be throwing bottles and rocks and stuff at demonstrators. Now they just sort of watch in silence as the demonstrations take place. And Bull Connor at one point, tried to stop a group of demonstrators on their way to a prayer vigil, and when they refused, Connor ordered his men to, do their dirty business, but this time they couldn't. King says, quote, Connor's men, as though hypnotized, fell back, their hoses sagging uselessly in their hands, while several hundred Negroes marched past them without further interference, end quote. So we're seeing the resolve and the resistance of the racists start to break down somewhat. And the city officials know that the demonstrations, they're not likely to stop anytime soon. So like in Montgomery and Alabama, they want to talk now. And after several days of talks, King and the city come to an agreement about stopping the demonstrations, similar to the agreement that was reached in Montgomery, desegregate the public places, hire black folks, cease the harassment, etc. But upon hearing this agreement had been reached, there was a backlash from the Klan, and they bombed King's brother's house, and they bombed the hotel where King was staying. Fortunately, at the time, King was in Atlanta, or he would have been killed, and his brother wasn't at home, or he would have been killed as well. And Governor Walker, sent his conservation men, aka stormtroopers, to Birmingham to deal with the black folks trying to take advantage of this newly passed desegregation law. Because since he, no longer had the law on his side, he was going to beat the black folks in Alabama into submission. Because, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, or whatever. It got so bad that the president, old Jack Kennedy, had to send a National Guard down to Birmingham to stop these disgruntled white people from terrorizing the black population. That same month, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that Bull Connor and his supporters were to be out of office for good. So the next part of the book, we see King set his sights on the struggle beyond the Negro in the South. He said the Negro in the North came to the shocking realization that the subtle and hidden discrimination of the North was as humiliating and vicious as the obvious and overt sins of the South, end quote. And this coincided with A. Philip Randolph's suggestion that they march on Washington to really show the full strength of the movement. So on August 28th, 1963, about a quarter million people arrived in Washington, D.C. to show that a change was coming. And this is where King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech that they like to trot out, every January on his birthday. Like, that's the only thing he ever said. And that's why I wanted to start this podcast with King, because despite all of the writing that he did and all the information that we have about his life and how brilliant he was, we seem to only be exposed to a small portion or aspect of his characters and his thought process and his ideas through the media. The I Have a Dream speech is one of the greatest like American statements of all time, like the Gettysburg Address or something. But King was very critical of several aspects of human society, and we just seem to ignore, these other things that he said. And I hope that by the end of this, you get an idea of some of the other things that were going on in King's head at the time. In in late 1963, you start to see a tide is coming though. Desegregation laws are beginning to be passed throughout the South. Demonstrations have increased. There are a bunch of different groups popping up that have nothing to do with King and his organizations. And the entire like social order of the country is about to change. And obviously, there's some people who don't want to see anything like this happen, and they're going to go through murderous lengths to keep that from happening, because it's not like they haven't already tried to kill the different leaders of these various movements. In September of 1963, the Sixth Avenue Church in Birmingham was bombed while 4 little girls were inside. And King was asked to give a eulogy at their funeral a few days later. And a few days after that, December 19th, one of King's most powerful allies was killed. John F. Kennedy was shot in the head in Dallas, Texas. And at this point, I want you to ask yourself, what would you do in this environment? I mean, King had to feel incredibly vulnerable at this point. I mean, in 1 week, these people had the heartlessness to kill 4 little girls and the balls to kill a president all in the same week. This is a productive period for hatred. Like, they usually try to spread the murder and the terror out a little bit. But like I said, these times are changing, and the racists, they didn't like that. Kennedy was likely killed for more than just, his stance on civil rights. But at this time in American history, there was so much hate. Like, at this time in American history, we hated each other maybe more then than we do now. No, Lord knows how much we can't stand each other now. But America was so sick at the time that kids weren't even safe. Not even the most powerful man in the free world was safe. So if you're King at this point in history, they've already tried to get you. What do you do? Well, you know what he did. He kept going. In 1964, King goes to Florida, to St. Augustine, Florida, to be exact, because as the movement goes on and it becomes more clear that segregation is on the way out, there are groups that are going to fight both tooth and nail to preserve this way of life. And in St. Augustine, the Klan kidnapped and beat 4 black folks unconscious. Now, the difference between a place like St. Augustine and Alabama was that in Alabama, they at least tried to use or not use violence all the time. I mean, Bull Connor only holds some of the protesters some of the time, right? But in Florida, they didn't try to play that game at all. Their position was basically, if you protest down here, you're going to catch these hands, or a gun handle, or a bomb in your hotel. And the population of black people in St. Augustine was so much smaller than that in Birmingham. Like, only 3,700 black people lived in St. Augustine at the time. And you had, almost 30,000 black people in Birmingham. And King says for several months, the people there in St. Augustine, they fought bravely against the brutality of the racism that threatened their lives, man. It was like, you had Spartan 300 down there trying to fight these folks. Eventually, King and the SCLC were able to get the governor to reach out to 4 influential business leaders in St. Augustine, and they worked with King to form what they called a biracial committee to address the segregation and violence going on in that community. And since Kennedy was dead, King was now relying on Lyndon B. Johnson to push through any new civil rights legislation he would need to get things done. And it wasn't really clear that Johnson was willing to take up, that part of Kennedy's agenda. But on July 2nd, after leaving St. Augustine and the newly formed biracial committee there, King was witness to Johnson signing the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, a bill that the business community in St. Augustine said that they would abide by. And now that we finally have a civil rights bill, you would start to think that things are going to get better, right? The people will get the message and let change happen. But no, this country has a habit of reacting violently to legal decisions that it doesn't like. And like King said earlier, we might think that old man racism is on his deathbed, but here come people with the tents to keep it alive. In Mississippi, around the time the Civil Rights Bill had passed, 3 workers, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, were pulled over, kidnapped by the police, and taken to a secluded location and shot in the head. And what they were doing in Mississippi was registering people to vote. which was, important, which is important to democracy, but especially important during the 1964 presidential election because of, the changes King sees happening in the Republican Party. Like these days, most black folks agree that the Republican Party is a comfortable home for racists and for bigots. But this wasn't always the case, and King witnessed this transition during the presidential election in 1964. Since the Democratic Party was now supporting the civil rights movement, the racists and the Southern Democrats had to find another party, and they built like rats from a sinking ship. And they found a home in the Republican Party. And he watched the Republican Party nominate a man named Barry Goldwater as the candidate for the president of the United States. And while he says Goldwater wasn't a racist, he, quote, articulated a philosophy which gave aid and comfort to racists, end quote, which sounds very familiar to our current president. Well, except there was never President Goldwater. Fortunately, he lost to Lyndon B. Johnson in that election year. King also won the Nobel Prize for Peace that same year, and he said something that stuck out to me in this chapter of the book. He said, quote, "Though the people of color are a minority here in America, there are billions of colored people who look to the United States and her Negro population to demonstrate that color is no burden or obstacle in the modern world," end quote. Which is something I thought about before. Like, can you name another minority group, like from another country? What's the minority group from Russia? Or China? Like, I know they exist. Almost all nations have a marginalized, oppressed group within their borders, but how many of them have influenced culture and politics around the world? There's definitely something special about us here, and I hope that we can explore some of that magic, man, during the course of this podcast, some of that black magic, you understand me? All right, now we get closer to the end of the book. King, or the book, whatever, because like I said, this thing really is just a collection of King's writings about his life, then arranged to tell this story. So as we get to this part in the book, King shifts his focus from campaigning in the South for basic human rights to other parts of the country, as well as some other people that are engaging in the struggle as well. And some of these other people include Malcolm X. And like King and X really didn't have too many interactions during their heyday, which is a shame because who knows what they could accomplish, if they would have worked together. But King obviously didn't agree with X's message of the Ballad of the Bullet. They met once briefly, face to face in D.C., and X actually visited Selma during those demonstrations, but King was in jail at the time and they didn't get the chance to talk. But King actually didn't want, X down there at the time. Malcolm was speaking at the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, when the students asked him to come to Selma and speak there as well. And according to Malcolm, Coretta and Andrew Young kind of tried to pull some shenanigans when he got there to keep him from talking to the people, because he was going to tell them nonviolence was some bullshit. They going to lock y'all up and beat y'all and kill y'all for nothing. He spoke to like 300-400 people down there anyway. And that's where he gave his House Negro, Field Negro speech. The We Sick Boss, that speech, he did that in Selma when King was in jail. But despite this, King made it clear that he had great respect for Malcolm X. He just didn't agree with his methods. He said, quote, "I was in jail when he was in Selma, Alabama. I couldn't block his coming, but my philosophy was so antithetical to the philosophy of Malcolm X that I would never have invited Malcolm X to come to Selma when we were in the midst of a nonviolent demonstration. This says nothing about the personal respect I had for him," end quote. So the reason the students in Tuskegee asked X to come to Selma in the first place was because it was going down in Selma. It was St. Augustine and Albany and Birmingham all wrapped into one. I mean, Selma, in Selma, they wouldn't let the people march, pray, protest, demonstrate, nothing. They wouldn't allow black folks to register to vote. They wouldn't let them look at a polling place, even after the Civil Rights Bill had been passed. And they jailed thousands of demonstrators, hence why King was in jail when Malcolm X got there. And of course, they were violent against the demonstrators and the protesters. And the pattern there in Selma was just like what we saw in Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, and other parts of Alabama. King and his demonstrators would march or pray or engage in some form of protest, and they would either be beaten or arrested for their efforts, all for seeking the right to vote. And the city tried to act like they were providing opportunities for black people to vote. And they opened registrar's office for only like a limited amount of time for you to register to vote. They only opened that office for you to do that for a couple of hours a day and only a few days out of the week. And it was this complicated literacy test that goes along with it that disqualified black folks from even passing the test. King says, quote, to date, only 57 persons have entered the registrar's office, while 280 have been jailed. Of the 57 who have attempted to register, none have received notice of successful registration, end quote. And when King and his people tried to march and demonstrate like they had been doing, over the first few months of 1965, they were brutalized by the Alabama State Troopers. And what's significant about this episode in Selma is that there were a lot of news media and cameras and stuff down there. And even today, you can go online and see the footage of those people being hosed, being beaten, being bit up by dogs. And while this whole time, King is in communication with Lyndon B. Johnson about drafting and passing a voting rights bill. So really, they can stop going through this shit. But Johnson is pretty much like, look, man, I got a lot of other stuff to do. We got the civil rights bill passed. Just hold tight, and we'll take care of it eventually. But, I got some other things on my plate right now. King's like, okay, all right, cool. We marching anyway. And after news coverage of all the violence and the beatings and a reverend from Boston being killed during this time, Johnson had to step it up, and get the bill passed in March 1965. So King and the SCLC have developed a strategy, a series of techniques that work all throughout the South. When you have a clearly defined, obviously racist, hateful, violent army, it's easy to take the moral high road. Well, I shouldn't say easy, but they were killing people. Like, that's not easy to deal with. But it's more feasible for you to develop a strategy to deal with somebody that's coming at you head on. That's an obvious opponent. But what do you do in a situation where the city officials and the people of the community don't think they racist? Like, where they think they're much better than the violent bigots of the South, despite living in clearly segregated cities like Watts or Chicago. In the 1960s, there were riots, looting, burning, and violence all over the place. And King was asked to come to Watts to speak to the community and possibly bring an end to all the chaos. And what King says about Watts is like, look, all this stuff that we did in the South for racial equality, desegregation, and voting rights don't matter to the black people in the North because they were supposed to already have these things. But when you look at the way that these people were treated, in their communities, the police brutality, the disrespect from business owners of being forced to live in a limited area of the city, it was only a matter of time before the people lost it. And in Watts, we see King really suffer his first defeat in that, like, he set out, to bring an end to the rioting there, and the people just didn't care. They didn't have a specific goal like King and the SCLC did in the South. King said, quote, I was out in Watts during the riots. One young man said to me, Andy Young, Baynard Rustin, and Bernard Lee, who were with me, we won. I said, what do you mean we won? 30-some people dead, all about 2 were Negroes. You destroyed your own. What do you mean we won? And he said, we made them pay attention to us. When people are voiceless, they will have temper tantrums like a little child who has not been paid attention to. And riots are massive temper tantrums from a neglected and voiceless people. End quote. Okay, kind of condescending, but you get his point. If you're going to turn up, do it for a reason. At least get something out of it besides the destruction of your own community. And part of the reason King said he was unsuccessful in Watts was because, quote, there was joy among the rioters, end quote. He also said there was a, quote, hardened criminal element incapable of restraint by appeals to reason or discipline, end quote. And I imagine those people he was talking about were the precursors to, Crips and the Bloods that grew out of California a few years later if they hadn't already started already. King was also worried about this spirit of rioting spreading to the South because many white people were arming themselves, getting ready for this kind of thing to happen. King said, quote, in the kind of atmosphere, a single drunken disorderly King said, quote, in this kind of atmosphere, a drunken, disorderly Negro could set off a panic button that might result in the killing of many innocent Negroes, end quote. But King recognized the city officials of LA had created this environment by repealing fair housing laws and oppression that had a different flavor than what was served, in the South, but was just as effective at subjugating and oppressing black people. King said, quote, a person participates in this society primarily as an economic entity, At rock bottom, we are neither poets, athletes, nor artists. Our existence is centered in the fact that we are consumers because we first must eat and have shelter to live. This is a difficult confession for a preacher to make, but it is a phenomenon against which I will continue to rebel, but it remains the fact that consumption of goods and services is the raison d'etre of the vast majority of Americans. When persons are for some reason or another excluded from the consumer circle, there is discontent, and unrest, end quote. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I mispronounced that French, but you get the point. And King, unfortunately, he had a similar experience when he went to Chicago. In the summer of '65, he was invited there by city leaders, to do, to work with the coordinating council, community organizations, all these different acronyms and names and all of this stuff, man. Damn, all these different groups. But anyway, he was asked to come there by the coordinating councils of community organizations in Chicago to try to help the campaign for education equality. And one thing I thought was interesting and goes to support, my idea that King was really a general on campaign was that he said something to the effect of, we sent our advanced scout team to lay the groundwork for our movement. So he sent a group of people out there to kind of, like an event, like any good general, you would send a good scout to get a lay of the land before you showed up with your army to start putting in work. And what he eventually decided that the SCLC had to do was just more than just assist with the education efforts down there. They had to address many of the other social issues going on in Chicago at the time. And in 1965, King did something I think had to be, a pure manifestation of his Christian values. He moved to Chicago, right in the hood though, to a place called Lawndale, on the west side of Chicago with his family too, man, which is, Coretta had to be like, nigga, this the trap, what the fuck? But part of his reasoning for moving to Lawndale was because, quote, there, the problems of poverty and despair were more than an economic or academic exercise, end quote. He got to see the types of games, these northerners and big city people played in these so-called progressive communities, with black folks. They'd restrict black people to only live in a certain area, and not run bus lines through it so that people couldn't get back and forth to work. They're overcharging people for rent. Most of these people were renting from slumlords, and they weren't allowed to own homes, or it was like extremely difficult to own homes, and the schools were some garbage. King says this exploitation was possible because so many residents of the ghetto had no personal means of transportation. It was a vicious cycle. You could not get a job because you were poorly educated, and you had to depend on welfare to feed your children. But if you received public aid in Chicago, you could not own property, not even an automobile, so you were condemned to do jobs and shops closest to your home. Once confined to this isolated community, you were no longer participated in a free economy, but it was subject to price fixing and wholesale robbery by many of the merchants in the area, end quote. Now you can see how King's thoughts have, expanded, to see more than just this surface level face of oppression, and begins to see like the mechanisms and how they work under the surface in an environment that's trying to present itself other than what it is. Like up north, you got all of these progressive people telling you, oh no, we treat our Negroes much better than they do in the South. But then when you look at how black folks are living in Chicago, are living in Harlem, how they're living in Watts, like y'all don't treat them no better than they do in Alabama. And these people, they really had their foot on this black community's neck and was like, oh, black people, they just live over there, not like in Georgia though. We've been trying to get the bus lines to work, but it's just taking us, a little longer than we thought. They had all these excuses. King even said, living in Chicago was starting to get to his kids. King said, quote, our own children live with us in Lawndale, and it was only a few days before we became aware of the change in their behavior. Their tempers flared, and they sometimes reverted to an almost infantile behavior. During the summer, I realized that the crowded flat in which we lived was about to produce an emotional explosion in my own family. It was just too hot, too crowded, too devoid of creative forms of recreation. There was just not space enough in the neighborhood to run off the energy of childhood without running into busy, traffic-laden streets. And I understood anew the conditions which make the ghetto an emotional pressure cooker. It was a hard time, man. And right after that, he wrote, quote, "In all the speaking I have done in the United States before varied audiences, including some hostile whites, the only time I've ever been booed was that one night in our regular weekly mass meeting by some angry young men of our movement," end quote. He wasn't trying to hear that nonviolent stuff, man. And black people in Chicago were tired of the mistreatment and they started to riot. And as more protests turned to riots, the white folks of Chicago started to let their bigotry show. King said, quote, "Swastikas bloomed in Chicago parks like misbegotten weeds. Our marches were met with a hailstorm of bricks, bottles, and firecrackers. White power became the racist catcall, punctuated by the violence of obscenities," end quote. Got so bad, it got so bad, even the white liberal people, King's allies in Chicago, asked if he would stop because they were afraid of the white backlash. And King's response was that hatred was already there, man. Like, the marches only brought this stuff to the surface. Like, where the swastikas come from? We didn't bring them with us, you know? But none of the demonstrators ever retaliated. And King eventually did win some of the young brothers over, and got them to adhere to this nonviolent strategy. And he said, about one of the many marches that they held in Chicago, quote, "I remember walking with a group of Blackstone Rangers while bottles were flying from the sidelines, and I saw their noses being broken and blood flowing from their wounds. I saw them continue and not retaliate, not one of them, with violence," end quote. But the strategy did evolve in Chicago and the LCLC along with the CCCO, all these damn acronyms groups. But they developed a strategy to move the agenda along that involved the people more, and more grassroots, hands-on approaches. He said they came up with tenant unions, which acted, a lot like labor unions, so people who were renting, in a certain area could work together to make sure that the rent stayed at a certain price and that landlords couldn't take advantage of people. They concentrated on housing rehabilitation to improve the quality of housing and fix old-ass buildings. The last program he mentioned was something called Operation Breadbasket, whose slogan was, quote, "If you can respect my dollar, you can respect my person," end quote, which basically meant, look, if you're going to take my money, you're going to have to hire some of my people to work here, and you can't overcharge me and you can't exploit me. And by 1967, the program was very successful, not only in Chicago, but in cities, all around the country. But in Chicago, King said, quote, "The net results added up to approximately 800 new and upgraded jobs for Negro employees, worth a little over $7 million in new annual income for Negro families. We added a new dimension to Operation Breadbasket, along with requesting new job opportunities. We requested that businesses with stores in the ghetto deposit the income for the establishments in Negro-owned banks, and that Negro-owned products be placed on the counters of all their stores," end quote. Now, King is talking about that money specifically, not just dignity, justice, the equality of all men and whatnot. No, he's talking about $7 million being moved into the hood where it can really do some good, bars. And I can't help but to think that this part of his strategy is what made King so dangerous to the white establishment. Like, it's one thing to say that you're going to have to make me eat, next to you on a lunch counter. It's another thing to say that you're going to make me share in this wealth that I've earned by taking advantage of you and your peoples. Nah, you can't mess with my income. You can't mess with my money, man. And by the end of March of 67, the city had reneged on all of the promises they had made to end housing discrimination. King said, quote, "We reached the summit, and then nearly 7 months later, we found that much of the ground had been cut out from beneath us." End quote. He goes on to say, quote, "We found ourselves confronted by the hard realities of a social system in many ways more resistant to change than the South. While we were under no illusions about Chicago, in all frankness, we found a job greater than we imagined," end quote. Chicago was a different beast, man. And as you can see at this time, King is dealing with, let's say, more combative Negroes. Right. In 1966, there was a civil rights leader in Mississippi named James Meredith. And he wanted to march from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi by himself, though, because he didn't want none of the other major civil rights groups involved in what he was doing. Now, you might question the wisdom of marching solo for freedom in the Deep South, but Meredith didn't question that. and he was shot in the back by a white man while trying to make this march by himself. I shouldn't laugh. He's still alive. But after learning that he hadn't died, King and some of the SCLC went to the hospital in Memphis where he was to check on him and to give their support. And while in that hospital, they were met by Stokely Carmichael, who would eventually become the leader of the Black Panther Party. But at this time, he was still a part of the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So they all decided to hold another march in Mississippi. And this time, Meredith wouldn't be by himself. He would have SNCC and the SCLC and some other organizations to support him. But, you know, even in Mississippi, black folks were getting frustrated, and they were letting King know that. During one of the protests, someone said, quote, "I'm not for that nonviolent stuff anymore," shouted one of the younger activists. "If one of them damn white Mississippi crackers touches me, I'm going to knock him the hell out," shouted another. Later on, a discussion of the composition of the march came up. "This should be an all-black march," said another. "We don't need any more white phonies and liberals invading our movement. This is our march," end quote. Man, they didn't even want to sing "We Shall Overcome" no more. They said this is a new day. We don't want to sing no songs anymore. In fact, the whole song should be discarded. Not "We shall overcome," but "We shall overrun." And you really can't blame a lot of these younger activists who have watched their parents, grandparents, mentors, pastors, or whoever get beat up, spit on, hosed by police and state troopers, and by their white neighbors. You know, there's only so much a person can take before they want to lash out, or at the very least protect themselves. And King did have an opinion on self-defense. He said, quote, "Finally, I contended that the debate over the question of self-defense was unnecessary, since few people suggested that Negroes should not defend themselves as individuals when attacked. The question was not whether one should use his gun when his home is attacked, but whether it is tactically wise to use a gun while participating in an organized demonstration," end quote. In other words, leave your guns at the crib when it's time to march, but if somebody show up at the house messing with me and Coretta and them kids, it's chitty chitty bang bang, baby. I can't remember where I read this, but I do remember reading that King was strapped up at his house, you know, because he was in the Deep South, and, you know, that's part of Southern culture, having guns. And not to mention, they were bombing his house and shit. So during, you know, round 2 of the march through Mississippi, King got to hear a phrase that, you know, we're all very familiar with today, but was kind of radical at the time, which was Black Power. And King says on the way to Jackson, they stopped in a city called Greenwood, Mississippi, which was SNCC territory. You know, and Stokely Carmichael couldn't wait to get there on the stage and tell the people what we need right now, Black Power. What do we want? Black Power, back and forth with the crowd. And he really got the people worked up. And King was like, alarmed at this. He said, quote, "I had reservations about his use. You know, I had the deep feeling that it was an unfortunate choice of words," end quote. He also said, quote, "There was a kind of concrete," he also said, quote, "There's a kind of concrete, real Black power that I believe in. I don't believe in Black separatism. I don't believe in Black power that would have racist overtones. But certainly if Black power means the amassing of political, economic power in order to gain our just and legitimate goals, then we all believe in that," end quote. But that's exactly what Carmichael and a lot of his protesters were going for. They viewed the world through, you know, a postmodernist type of lens that divided the world into those that had power and those that didn't have it. And King describes this conversation with Carmichael. Quote, "Stokely replied by saying that the question of violence versus nonviolence was irrelevant. The real question was the need for Black people to consolidate the political and economic resources to achieve power. Power," he said, "is the only thing respected in this world, and we must get it at any cost." He said, he then looked at me squarely in the eye and said, "Martin, you know as well as I do that practically every other ethnic group in America has done just this. The Jews, the Irish did, and the Italians did it. Why can't we?" "That is the point," I answered. "No one has ever heard the Jews publicly chant the slogan of Jewish power, but they have power. Through group unity, determination, and creative endeavor, they have gained it. The same thing is true of the Irish and Italians. Neither group has used the slogan of Irish or Italian power, but they have worked hard to achieve it. This is exactly what we must do," I said. "We must use every constructive means to amass economic and political power. This is the kind of legitimate power we need. We must work to build racial pride and refute the notion of Black is evil and ugly. This must come through a program, not merely through a slogan, end quote. So as a compromise, they decided not to use any slogans during the rest of the marches down in Mississippi. But I think this interaction, with these young radicals did affect his thinking because in 1968, King said this, quote, "There are points at which I see the necessity for temporary segregation in order to get to the integrated society. I can point to some cases. I've seen this in the South in schools being integrated, and I've seen it in the teachers' associations being integrated. Often, when they merge, the Negro is integrated without power. We don't want to be integrated out of power. We want to be integrated into power. And this is why I think it is absolutely necessary to see integration in political terms, to see that there are some situations where separation may serve as a temporary way station to the ultimate goal which we seek, which I think is the only answer to the final analysis to the problem of a truly integrated society," end quote. Which makes sense, right? Because what's the point of integration if you're just gonna fire me? And that's what happened to a lot of black teachers and principals when they were integrated into white schools, along with their children. The government's excuse for not hiring black people was that black kids being educated by black folks was equal to child abuse, despite the fact that black people's grades and graduation rates and test scores dropped dramatically after being integrated in the 1960s. So towards the end of his life, we see King making all types of connections between, local oppressed communities and international politics and economics. And he was a big opponent of the Vietnam War, mainly because the government was sending poor black people to kill poor Vietnamese people halfway around the world and still treating them like shit when they came back home. And King had people all in his inbox. Like, hey, man, you a reverend. Stick to that social stuff. This is international politics. This war stuff. This is outside your realm of expertise. But King is like, I can speak out against whatever the fuck I want to because y'all using my tax money to bomb kids and kill innocent people. He said, quote, "Those who lynch, pull the trigger, point the cattle prod, or open fire hoses act in the name of the silent. I had to therefore speak out if I was to erase my name from the bombs which fell over North and South Vietnam, from the canisters of napalm," end quote. By 1967, King is beginning to turn his attention fully to economic and political power for black people. And to achieve this goal, he and the SCLC developed something called the Poor People's Campaign, with the goal of securing jobs and income for everyone. This campaign included everybody, poor people, black people, white people, Hispanic people, Native, everybody. It was a rainbow coalition before Fred Hampton did it. And this campaign also included unions and workers. And this aspect of the program is what brought, Martin Luther King to Memphis, the last city in his great campaign that started all the way back in 1954 in Montgomery. In the March of 1968, the sanitation workers in Memphis went on strike because of unfair treatment. King doesn't really describe the unfair treatment, but you can imagine these guys probably were overworked, underpaid, looked over for promotions or management positions. The same thing that goes on today. And King goes into Memphis with the same spirit, the same tactics. We're going to march, we're going to protest, we're going to demonstrate until we get the fair treatment that we deserve. And the good old boys in Memphis just weren't having it. And some of the marches turned violent. But King held out hope, and he said to his right-hand man, Ralph Abernathy, they really have a great movement going on here in Memphis, which they did. The sanitation workers, without any union, any form of representation, walked out of their jobs in February of that year. But, unfortunately, King wouldn't be allowed to see the end of another successful campaign because around 6 p.m. on March 4th, he was standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, and a 30-06 bullet entered his cheek and destroyed several vertebrae and arteries in his neck and chest, and he was pronounced dead about an hour later. And the shooter was a dude named James Earl Ray, who was an escaped convict and was on the loose for about 2 months after that before they caught him trying to board a plane in London with a fake passport. And interestingly enough, Ray's mother wrote a letter to Coretta, sending her condolences and sorrow over what her son had done. And King's death illustrates to me that at this time in our country's history, it didn't really matter how you tried to address the racial injustice in this country, whether it be through nonviolence, through rebellious actions, whether you're a pastor, a student, a radical Muslim. It didn't matter. Somebody somewhere had a bullet for you. And the nature of our our protests, and our rhetoric started to change. After the King's death, you see more, radical, openly combative black folks, because to them it was clear America was the enemy. And even though King knew he was likely going to be killed, he even told Coretta as much after Kennedy was assassinated. I don't think he would want us to lose hope in a fair and just society. It won't be, a easy thing to accomplish. There's still likely to be more pain and suffering along the way. But as King says, later towards the end of his book, either we go up together or we go down together, and let us develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. And I guess that's what I want you to take away from this episode, to be dangerously unselfish. I think that's one of the many things King would have wanted us to do. So that's it for me, bro. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. If you made it this far, if you want to reach out to me, comment on this episode, check me out at Codabang on Instagram, or you can go to theghettoscholarspodcast.com for links and an article that I'm writing on this book. If you want to buy a t-shirt to support the podcast, that'd be cool. If you like it, share it, leave a review, all that good stuff. The next full episode will be up September 1st. But check with me, in the next couple of weeks, man. I'll be back to check in on y'all, answer any questions, respond to anything that you guys might have asked, send me a message, whatever, in the next few weeks. Until then, peace, peace, peace.